Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, destined to bear the jewelled crown of Aquilonia on a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell you of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. Now things had come to a bit of a head, which does seem to be somewhat of a silly saying, really, as coming to a head doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, really. Certainly not under the dire circumstances we now find our illustrious hero. For Kronan was about to get into one of the most uneven fights he had ever witnessed, let alone participated in directly. But Kronan, that most orky of all orcs on all of Aquilonia, would have it no other way. For he was the receptacle of the glory of the gods, the emissary in the mortal realms. He was an adherent of Gork and Morg. But it must be said, as so many others leant entirely on the works of Gork, he of brutal cunning, Kronan was somewhat of an oddity in that he was an advocate of all things Morkish. Now that is not to say that he was overly sentimental. Nothing could be further from the truth. But he was known all across his world as the Cunning One. He was a servant of both gods, of course, but he was one of the few in recent years who had truly channeled the undisputed power of Mork, the orc god of cunning brutality. He had harnessed the dire power of cunning. Now, this is not to say that anyone could outdo him in brutality, for such would be an utter misrepresentation of the facts, and it is, in fact, the absolute unvarnished self-evident truism that Kronan was the most brutal of all orcs on Aquilonia as well. Had he not won victories against the Humies themselves? His meteoric rise to power had been nothing but a masterclass in brutality, but it had always been an upshot of his adroit deployment of cunning. From the first armour he had captured from the Humies, all the way to his matching and besting them, quite tidily actually, on the open field of battle. And no orc war boss had managed to defeat a massed army of the Humies in living memory. But more than this, even in legend. There was Baldermort the Boisterous, who had managed to kill a whole squad of marines all on his own. There was Fartus Maximus, who had defeated a whole score of Humie horsey riders when they raided his camp. But these had been short highlights in an otherwise rather doleful relationship with the Humies on Aquilonia. Oh, fighting had always been a fun element of life on this verdant world, but it had always been met with swift and effective counterattacks that had returned the status quo pretty much immediately. For Baldermort the Boisterous had been captured by the Adipi Arstarters, and summarily executed by firing squad. Well, more to put it, the 3 squads of marines hove into view and then peppered him with bolt of fire until there was no 2 scraps of the boss more than 2 millimeters together in one place. Alas, Fartus Maximus had also been the recipient of a close encounter with a power sword when the marines came back to the region only 2 days later. And thus it was that Kronan had been the first boss to have had a lasting victory. He had taken a column of Humie metal boxes, and then, without so much as a by your leave, he had done the impossible. He had taken a whole Humie settlement. From there, the growth of his war had been stellar. Not that anyone would have put it that way, as it is far too flowery and a bit poxy, so I'm told. But the sentiment remains the same. Kronan's star was rising, and fast. He had amassed a huge war, the first seen on Aquilonia, ever, it seemed at least. But as things always do, for nature abhors vacuum cleaners, or something like that, a competitor war arose or so. When Kronan led the Kunnin War, his arch-enemy Toof Smasher had raised a Speed Waaargh. Now to say that old Toofy was an arch-enemy to Kronan sort of makes it seem like that they had some form of protracted and in-depth, convoluted backstory, where they had met and perhaps become friends, a Romeo and Juliet tale, perhaps, where they became closer despite their familial differences and the cultural clash that would often underline it. Or that it was some form of buddy tale, like Dumblesnore and Grumpelwald, friends, or even more, then forced to confrontation due to a tragic realization of their differences in their worldviews. This was certainly not the case. To be frank or earnest, for reasons we have discussed before, Kronan had never heard of Toof Smasher, his tribe, or their horrible weakness before he had controlled nearly half of the planet. Only then was it revealed that perhaps he should not have been quite so imperious about who to take into his war, as it struck Kronan, as related in the Squid Game, that he had sneered at many an applicant and thus forced entire tribes of orcs to look for other leadership. His truculence was never in question, as this led to fightiness, which of course is the prime requisite for any orc, let alone the most orky of all orcs, a big boss. But perhaps he should have just taken the heads of the annoying or vexing bosses of said tribes and absorbed them into his own war without delay. But such is life. Better to fail upwards than consistently strive for safety and mediocrity. For instance, Kronan could have kept on the path his small tribe had always maintained, the defence of their tiny valley, fighting the other local tribes for small tracts of land. Not large tracts of land, but that's a different matter. But instead, Kronan had seen the light. In a rare event, he had been initiated into the deeper secrets of the gods. He had witnessed the coming of the prophet of the gods. He had truly heard them. And from that day forward, Kronan had attempted to bring Kunnin into his life. And it was this fundamental change in perspective that had brought him all of the success and victory he had ever yearned for. Nothing worth doing is easy, as they say. Well, the humies do anyways. Apart from fighting, doing things the hard way was definitely not the way of the greenskin. Let's be honest, anything outside of the furore of combat was dull and rather inconvenient to most orcs. So doing things the easy way, the path of least resistance, was most often the absolute default setting for most true orcs. Because doing things the hard way took time, and that was time not spent in fighting, which was clearly a waste. Yet Kronan had managed to somehow defeat this ingrained preponderance of his kind. He had truly listened to the prophet. He had taken heart and learned. He had learned mightily. For Kronan had then set forth on the most dangerous of all paths, the path of cunning. Now one might not think that being cunning could be such a high risk to the individual in question. Certainly not a strapping orc such as Kronan. But this was the foolishness of the naive, the desperate stupidity of the uninitiated. For to be cunning required thinking. And as had been attested in events of the Thinkmas celebrations, this could be tragically and very ultimately bad for one's health. Okay, in truth, Kronan had arranged matters so that the support structure of his main rivals had the correct headgear to be removed from play before the mighty Kronan cleared house. For he did not kill his main enemies via exploding thinking drot headgear. He merely removed their bodyguards so he could cut to the quick of the matter himself. And he did. For he took many a head that day, and the resultant scrapping in the war merely removed the chaff. Let the cream of the up-and-coming boys rise to the top, for things will be done in an altogether novel way, and the older, crustier bosses would not have been supple enough to keep up. So fresh blood at the top reinvigorated the entire war. Yet still there were some who could not stand to see the cunning ones succeed where they had failed. Treachery had led to the current circumstances, for the Speed Waaargh that had arisen from the dregs that Kronan had chided and rejected. They had gathered as opposition to his force. Such a strange thing. Like waiting for a conveyance on a particularly wet and dreary day, when one war appeared, thus did another form. There the orcs had been for years untold, waiting for a decent rumble, and then two factions arose at the same time. But this was a thing to be pondered on. Never, actually, as Kronan did not actually enjoy the process of thinking, as no orc should enjoy this dire and dark art. he would not be dwelling on this issue more than was absolutely necessary. And when I say absolutely necessary, this did not mean he would devote a few moments to it and then move on. No. Now that Kronan had embarked on this horrific practice, this golden path, he found that his mind was like a magnet to ideas. They would bound unbidden into his mind. And it is with no small consternation that our hero, for he certainly is thus, was prone to unelicited bouts of thinking. Now some days Kronan was of a mind to end it all, by simply cutting open his bonds, scooping out some of the tragically plaguing head matter that his weird boys had confirmed was indeed the source of his ideas, of the thinking. But then, would he not be turning his back on the gods? These ideas. They had been the curse of the god Mork, but this curse had led to victory after victory. It had led to him becoming the big boss of a war. So Kronan had decided that he could do nothing but continue on the path his lords had created for him. He would perhaps look into an idea-repulsing hat, for headgear was indeed the reason for much of his cunning. It cannot be denied. Thus hats might also be the way to protect his overtaxed mind, but this was for another time entirely. For at this present moment, he was about to engage in that oh-so-unfair battle. Old Toof Smasher had defeated Kronan with an amazingly lucky hit, the kid, then dragged him back to his camp to crow over him. The rather tangled events that ensued we have already covered, but it ended in the one point. The one situation that we are now gathered to recall. Well, I will be recalling it, and then imparting it to yourselves. But that is pedantry, really, and we have far more gripping events to cover. And thus it was that the scene was set. Kronan had survived the Squig Games. He had become the victor, and was thus initiated into the tribe of Toof Smasher, was technically now a member of the Speed Waaargh. But he had not bent the knee. He now challenged Toof Smasher as one of his own boys, a challenge that could not be ignored. Well, not if old Toofy wanted to see out the day and not be ripped apart by his own former followers, which would have been hilarious, but far less dramatic than the scene that is about to unfold. Trust me, this one is a corker. Toof Smasher, the traitor, the unorky, the weasel, whatever that is, had thrown in with the most rare of horrors, the unorky. He had within his inner circle scum that had turned to the gods of the Humies. Now Kronan was not sure which of them they had begun to worship, the girl, the fat one, the bookie bird, or the killer farter, but nor did he really care. A tragically large amount of orcs in this camp had even become red. They had fallen so far. And it was anathema to the whole of orkydom for even one boy to turn to that lackluster bunch. And, if truth be told, which we always try to do in these chronicles, Kronan was incensed. On a personal level. For he was now the toenail of the gods. He was the bogey flicked at their enemies, but with such force as to destroy them utterly. Thus Kronan was not just livid about the existence of a rival war, and one that did not even take on the Humies, but he was also filled with a righteous religious zeal. These red orcs were a sin against his gods, and they would have to be exterminated with extreme prejudice. Like really extreme. Just think of the most extreme prejudice you have ever felt, and then multiply it by 3, or even 4. So very extreme. But the most pressing issue was Kronan's present position. He had been victorious in the Squig Games, had bested every trial put before him, even with the old Toof Smasher stacking the deck against him at every turn. But this had been proven to be a fundamental error on the part of his rival. For he had not summarily executed Kronan, and then just wiped out any who would rebel. Toof Smasher had been manipulated by Kronan's astonishing cunning, so that he could take no overt action. And with each victory on the preceding days, Kronan had gained more and more influence and adoration from the members of the onlooking Speed Waaargh, and things had gotten to such a state that Toofy had simply no choice at all but to accept the blatant challenge from the newest member of his tribe, Kronan Da Kunnin. And so it was that the scene was set. Kronan, unarmoured, and from a dueling few days of utter mayhem, stood with his hands empty of weaponry and his stance wide in challenge, as Toof Smasher walked to the edge of the box he had been watching from and leapt down onto the arena sands. And his landing was everything one would expect from a big boss of orcs, especially in the very intimidating and exceptionally heavy set of mega armor. He hit the sands and sent them spraying as he rose from his kneeling position, fist impacting in the ground as well, of course. What some might call the superhero landing. But alas, these forms of vid or picked entertainment were not widely available in the grim darkness of the far future, as they would have been describing mutants. And this was certainly not an age of tolerance. So mutants would have been burned at the stake by the thin starters, with the white hair and the pointy noses. But I digress. Toof Smasher cared not that the battle would be so uneven, for he had not only mega armor on, but his finest panoply of war. His finest choppers, his finest shooters. To be honest, he was armed to the teeth, and even his teeth had weapons. All while Kronan was presently near naked. While he certainly did not have a big swanky power chopper on him, Kronan looked at the slowly advancing Toof Smasher, as the self-same drew out a particularly nasty-looking serrated chopper the size of a knob, which then shimmered as its power field buzzed into life. But Kronan was not called the cunning one for nothing. He recalled the tables of weapons that had been left by the Yellers when the last leg of the games had begun, and he performed his mighty backward salmon leap. With this, he was taken to the very edges of the tables, and without a second of thought, he grabbed two short choppers. Well, more daggers is what Humies would call them, but again, they overcomplicate everything with their endless lists and naming of things. But I digress. Now there was a veritable cornucopia of weapons at Kronan's disposal. Huge maces, warhammers, which was particularly poignant, spears and double-handed choppers. But none were weapons of worth. None were power weapons or chain choppers. Thus they were almost useless in the face of the walking tank-like mega armor that Toof Smasher had donned. Thus Kronan, without even acknowledging the fact, took up the weapons of cunning. For he could not match the strength of Toof Smasher in his armor, for it augmented the might of its wearer quite nicely. Thus it was that Kronan knew that the only weak point his hated enemy had was possibly the least important. Cunning unto itself, Kronan would have thought. Well, if he had time for cogitation, which he did not, for he was far too invested and excited by the confrontation that was about to ensue. A battle he had yearned for since he knew of the existence of the Speed Waaargh. It was time. Finally. It was time to see who had the love of the gods, who is the most orky orc on all of Aquilonia. The deck was again stacked against the Lord of the Cunning Waaargh, and Kronan, as I said, would not have had it any other way. Alas, as this is a skit of an 80s film, and the previous colossal works that it was based upon, of course, the inevitable could not be avoided. As Toof Smasher approached Kronan, he stopped at a respectable distance, and it began in earnest. The legendary pose-off. The ultimate aperitif to any duel of real import. The two knew exactly what was expected of them, and the crowd of orcs that watched on was agog at the spectacle. As Toof Smasher stopped, he slowly raised his arms over his head, and then slammed his left hand to join the right on the grip of his sword. He brought it down slowly until it was level with Kronan's head. The overhand reach. A standard pose, but a solid one. Kronan replied by turning his back to Toof Smasher and raising his own hands above his head, then bringing them to his sides with his biceps taut. Then the muscles down his back popped one after the other. Rippling rage. A move that could not be performed by Toof Smasher due to his armor. Kronan held the pose as the crowd went wild, then dropped it and glared at his enemy. The grinding of Toof Smasher's teeth in an unvarnished display of ire was like ambrosia to Kronan. Finally understanding his predicament, Toof Smasher then took on the roles that would be enhanced by his armour. It left him less versatility in the battle, but would hopefully pay dividends. As Toofy then dug one massive power-armoured boot into the ground, then the other, snorted and ran backwards and forwards in his zone. Galloping Squiggoth. Almost perfectly enacted. The rains of sand and sod that were thrown into the air were a spectacle not to be missed. Kronan had to think fast. He knew that ugly concubine, whatever that was off the menu. So, too, was Grot rolling in poo. An heroic landing had already been performed by Toofy. So he went into his best dance. He spread his legs wide and shuffled forward hunched over. He then stopped and raised his body up and put his hand over his eyes so he could see, and then dropped down again. Grot in the grass. A placeholder. Nothing flashy, but adequately done. Kronan would see what his rival had before unleashing his full power. Thus it was that Toof Smasher went into another power-armoured enhanced move, gargant stamping and scratching its ass. Intimidating to most, it left Kronan cold. The cunning one then responded with angry snot-wave. Aggressive, energetic, and it played well with his unfettered and unobscured musculature. Toof Smasher retaliated with a very safe option, thinking his the advantage. He beat his chest and shouted, throwing head back and laughing and pointing at Kronan, the use weedy move. But this was the end, for Kronan had outmaneuvered his opponent again. As the move from Toofy was only half done, Kronan went into Mork's Full Moon. He dropped his posing pouch and mooned at Toof Smasher at exactly the same time as he laughed at Kronan. Thus meaning, Toof Smasher was laughing at his own derision. Now that was a masterfully played move, as Toofy was now, quite literally, the butt of his own joke. And the response was immediate. Toof Smasher raised his chopper high and bellowed his most orky war cry as he charged at Kronan. A catastrophic faux pas for Toofy. For although rage and brutality were the key requisites of orkiness, so too was being seen as the biggest and most meaty, and in this loss of control, being baited by Kronan so much that he charged, Toofy had summarily and publicly lost the pose off. Round 1 to Kronan. The derision of the crowd was palpable, as they expected at least a dozen more moves before the initiation of actual combat, and again, most often these events were boring and merely a delay to the good bit, the fighting. But in this case, the spectacle had been enjoyed so much, the utter showmanship and magnetism of Kronan so dazzling, that they had not wanted it to end at all. But, as with all things, the orcs soon forgot all about their ire when the choppers were out and the clash had begun. Still, it did leave a rather ashen taste in the mouths of all who witnessed it. Well, mostly anyway. As things progressed, it was striking odd that large parts of the arena were now clearing. Not the majority, for certain, but Kronan could not help but clock that the majority of the red orcs had now made themselves scarce, including their leader, the weird boy and leader, Toba. He was no longer watching from the boss's big box. In fact, he was nowhere to be seen. But back to the main event. Toof Smasher charged. His mighty chopper in both hands, his armour glittering in the midday sun, he was impressive. But he was not nimble. The first strike was contemptuously easy for Kronan to evade, as he rolled right under the attack and came up behind Toof Smasher. Yet the rival orc was not a boss for nothing, and he wheeled like lightning. The backhand swipe of Toof Smasher forced Kronan to roll again, like an ultra-hard level AAA game, whatever that is. Kronan was rolling and dodging like an elder. He did all of this to remain in the fight, but more than this. He made it a part of the show, for Kronan could feel it, something he had not felt before. He was conscious and well acquainted with the feeling of his cunning rising, but this was different. He felt a power suffuse him, imbue him with preternatural speed and might. But, ho-ho, it was not coming from within. Kronan always marked his cunning rising, an itch in the back of his noggin that could then herald a painful and dangerous bout of unelicited thinking. But this was different, entirely different. With each time he rolled away from a strike, and then waded back in to carve a slice from his enemy, he stood back, took advantage of his supreme speed to perform spontaneous poses. He raised his hands above his head in victory. He sniggered dramatically at another failure from Toof Smasher. And with each of these misses, the poses, the derision, he gained greater cheers from those looking on. He could feel it, his name being chanted by the Speed Waaargh. He could feel their energy, their power, their elation, their excitement. He could feel it. Finally, beyond the power of Kunnin, more pure than the feeling of a human head collapsing under his booted foot, he could feel the Waaargh energy coursing through him. He could feel the Waaargh, and he could harness it. Kronan's last roll was accompanied with a grab of half a metric shit-ton of sand, which was then launched into the eyes of Toof Smasher as he rose. The dust hit the face of the orc and went into his eyes. Thrashing around with his chopper in an attempt to fend off Kronan, Toof Smasher backed away. Decidedly un-orky, thought Kronan. He should have gone on the attack. And for his cowardice, Kronan ducked under 2 blows and swept him past the wildly swinging chopper, crackling with worms of power, and he took off one of Toof Smasher's ears. He rolled away and held it up to the crowd, who, quite predictably, went wild again, bawling their approbation and veneration of the boss. The tide had certainly changed. All Kronan need do now was to best old Toofy, and it would all be over. As Kronan turned to barely avoid that massive chopper, he realized that this would not be as easy as he was making out to the onlooking mobs. The dance continued, with Toofy now wary, more shuffling forward and striking than putting all of his power into wild and wide swings. And thus, Kronan could not do his rolling about on the ground thing. So be it, he decided. Let the game be afoot. And with that, he blocked a strike, sacrificing one of his blades, which was carved straight through by Toof Smasher's power chopper, but it moved at that fine hair length required for Kronan to avoid the blow. And Kronan whipped up again and took off Toof Smasher's nose. The bloody green proboscis flopping to the ground. Now Toofy looked ridiculous. But both knew that this cosmetic damage to the least important part of any orc, their head, was naught but pantomime and showmanship. Intimidating and certainly ouchy, but nothing that would stop old Toofy. And thus it was that Toof Smasher backed off, panting hard, his mega armor now dragging him down into the lethargy of fatigue, or so thought Kronan. Toof Smasher then turned and ran toward one of the large gates that had been used as an entry point to the arena, and hacked at it twice. His massive chopper smashed the door to pieces, tendrils of energy erupting along the broken splinters of wood as they rained down on the arena. And behind the gate was a tidal wave of angry and hungry and very bitey squigs. As they charged over round beneath Toof Smasher, it was clear that he had planted his feet, and none of them could harm him in his mega armor. The same would not be true for Kronan. Thus it was that Kronan had to run from the squigs, get to the very edges of the arena, and then hurl himself up in one of his mighty leaps. Silence reigned across the bleachers as Kronan's hands scrambled for the lip and found it. There he hung, and all were aghast, for it looked like Kronan was running away. A cheer of deafening proportions went up as Kronan looked around and revealed his true intentions. He leapt down into the arena and landed on the back of one of the largest squigs there, and rode it to the other end of the arena. He was not fleeing at all, and all knew it. Silence again, as they all looked on, mesmerized by the actions of the cunning one. Kronan rode the squig, culling all around him that came close enough to be a threat, until he got to the other end of the arena. For there came a smashing from the other end of the place, behind another gate. When pressed later, Kronan did not know why he did what he did, could never explain how he knew what was behind the gate. He simply did not know. So later, he was sure of the one thing. He had been moved by Mork himself. Feeling the Waaargh energies as he had, he was now a living vessel of the power of the Waaargh. The power of the great gods Mork and Gork. And thus it was that he did not even skip a beat when he dragged open the mighty gates and found a huge avalanche of squigs there also. But it was a totally different premise this time, as at their head, unmistakably the largest squig that any had seen, was Tiddles, Kronan's very own pet squig. For in all the time of the games, the faithful Tiddles had made his presence felt in the camp, without his master to brook his more violent tendencies, or to direct them at the very least. Tiddles had intimidated a good swathe of the squigs in the camp, and when he went to the arena to free his master, or to fill his gut in the one place everyone seemed to be congregating, depending on your view of the intelligence of the squig, he brought a plethora of his kind in his wake, a veritable tsunami of them. And as the gates opened, Kronan leapt into the air and landed on the back of his loyal squig, and he bellowed his victory cry as he led the counterwave of squigs. Balls of teeth were rampaging back and forth, their violence a sacrament to the great gods, its brutality a thing of joy to the onlooking orcs. None had witnessed a squig war before, and they knew from that point onwards it was definitely something they needed in their lives. But I digress. Kronan rode Tiddles towards the waiting Toof Smasher, who had not moved an inch since smashing the gate. He leaned on his chopper and looked, well, quite pooped, really. Certainly not the type to elicit the loyalty of an entire war of good orky orcs. Nose gone and blood still flowing over his lips, tusks and chin. One ear ripped off, and one eye lost, blood around the socket. It seemed that the annoyance of the sand could not be shifted by old Toofy, so he had done the only logical thing and cut out the offending and annoying eye, with the sand in it. Yet the mega armor still crackled, the chopper still hummed with power, and he was far from done. Kronan leapt from the back of Tiddles and toward the boss, but cunning as ever, not directly at him. Thus, with Toofy's lack of depth perception, he lunged with his chopper to cut Kronan in half, only to sweep through the air some 6 inches to his side. Kronan landed and smashed his remaining knife into the arm socket of the mega armor. The right arm pinned in place, the sword clattered from Toof Smasher's grip. Toof Smasher reacted fast and had a power maul in his remaining operational left hand before Kronan could get away. Old Toofy was not to be taken lightly as he tagged Kronan. The maul came down on Kronan's left arm. Again, it was the best kind of muggins, and its power field did much to add to the impact. Kronan lost his left arm. It was torn from his torso and bounced soggily onto the sands. Yet Kronan was an orc in a trillion. He took the hit like a champ and decided to end the event once and for all. Kronan grabbed the dagger out of the arm and rammed it into the last remaining eye of Toof Smasher. Then he stepped back as the rival boss screamed and staggered backwards, and the rising feeling in Kronan erupted. It was like his heart burst, its blood taking fire down his entire body. It was the Waaargh. It was the power. It was the faith of his fellow orcs. He could practically taste it as he looked down at his remaining empty hand. A lampant green glow appeared there, a light that could be nothing but the blessing of the gods. For he had seen this self-same energy formed into great crushing feet stomps by his head weird boy, Weirdnut Krunkelstein. He knew it was the power of the gods. And so Kronan concentrated. He felt the energy flow from the crowd, flow into his body, and then he forced it into his very palm. And he took 2 steps forward, and then punched his fist toward the chest of Toof Smasher. The fist went forward, green energy surrounding it, until he made contact with the mega armor. In slow motion, Kronan witnessed the power of his gods, of the Waaargh, as his knuckles seemed to just slip through the mega armor, as if it were not even there. Aye, he was blessed with the fists of Gork, and the armor just parted around his balled fist. The hand then burst open, as Kronan reached into the body of Toof Smasher. and grasped, then yanked out his very heart. Kronan mused later that it was almost a shame that Toof Smasher had lost both of his eyes, as otherwise Kronan could have witnessed them opening into saucers like any human when faced with their demise. But, anticlimactically as it was, Toof Smasher just fell backwards onto the sands and expired. Of course, Kronan had to be absolutely sure of his victory, and so it was that he went about the swift but messy business of cutting off the head of Toof Smasher, which, with a wee dagger, took a bit of doing actually. Kronan rose and held the dripping head of Toof Smasher above him, enjoying the feeling of his rival's blood pouring onto his own noggin. He was anointed, not just in blood, not just in victory. As Kronan slowly turned 360 degrees, so that all could be absolutely certain of the outcome of the duel, he was awash in the chanting and the glorification of his name. He had done it. In this one battle, this one duel, he had done it. He, Kronan, the master of the Kunnin War, was now the undisputed boss of all orcs on Aquilonia. Or at least he would be, when the insult had been washed away, washed clean, when the true enemy had been defeated. Now many would believe that this would be the Humies, who still controlled much of the world, and certainly all of its most alluring real estate. But this was not the case. For Kronan knew that he could do it. He knew that with all of the orcs of Aquilonia marching to the one cadence, the one drum, there would be nothing he could not do, nowhere he could not take, no one who could gainsay him in his domination of the entire world. But one fly remained in the ointment, whatever that is. One thing left to be done before he crushed the remaining Humies in an attempt to gain the attention of the dippy arse-starters, the Space Marines, where the real fighting would begin. Perhaps, if he did well enough, went through enough of the colours and types, the Humies might even be forced to let him have a crack at the gold ones. The Mega Knob Marines. Yes, he wanted that very much. But one thing remained. The chaos-worshipping scum. The orcs who were not orcs. Toba and all of his ilk. They would need to be annihilated before all else. For it was the will of the gods. To be continued in The Hunt for Red Orctober.